Every winter, she lit the lanterns along his gate. Every winter, the house forgot she had. Linnea was the forgotten cousin, the unpaid companion of a family that treated her like a piece of furniture, useful for holding a shawl, invisible for everything else. So on the worst night of the season, with the great hall full of laughter and the winter season in full swing, not one person noticed that the gate had gone dark. But Linnea had spent years seeing what the house never did, what was failing, what no one tended, what was needed before anyone thought to ask. She took a lantern and walked out alone into the blizzard to relight a gate that mattered to no one. She did not do it to be thanked. She had stopped expecting that years ago. But the great tower of black granite above her was not as empty as the family believed, and someone behind its highest unlit window had been watching her do this for longer than anyone in that house had been alive. The winter that forgot her would be the last winter anyone ever could. If you believe one quiet act of courage can be seen across an ocean of indifference, type lantern below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know that Linnea had perfected the art of being invisible. She was a shadow in her own family, a plain brown wren in a flock of preening peacocks. Her cousin Beatrice, for whom she served as an unpaid companion, treated her as little more than a piece of furniture, useful for holding a shawl or fetching a forgotten book, but otherwise not worthy of a glance or a word. They were all guests at Blackwood Manor, this grand Gothic pile of stone and shadow that clung to the mountainside like a nesting raven. The host, Lord Valerius, was a man spoken of in whispers. He was impossibly wealthy, impossibly handsome, and impossibly cold. He moved with a liquid grace that seemed unnatural, and his stillness was more intimidating than any outburst of temper. When he entered a room, the candles seemed to gutter for a moment, and a chill would trace its way down your spine. A cold that had nothing to do with the winter drafts. The Ashworths, Linnea's family, had been angling for an invitation for years. Beatrice had her sights set on the lord of the manor, convinced her beauty could thaw his legendary frost. Linnea had no such ambitions. She was content to find a quiet corner in the vast library, losing herself in stories where forgotten girls were found and valued. It was a foolish private hope, and she knew it. In the real world, girls like her remained forgotten. The winter had been unusually harsh, and on this particular night, a blizzard descended with a sudden, violent fury. The wind howled like a hungry wolf against the stone walls, and snow fell in a blinding, disorienting sheet. Inside, a fire roared in the great hall, and Beatrice was holding court, complaining about a slight from another young lady. Her mother, Linnea's Aunt Elspeth, was fretting over the seating arrangement for the next night's dinner. No one was thinking about the storm, except for a young maid whose mother, the head cook, had taken grievously ill. A footman had been sent on horseback hours ago to fetch the doctor from the village 10 miles away, but the worsening storm made his return treacherous. The lanterns at the main gate, a half-mile down the winding drive, were the only beacon he would have. Linnea, sitting by a window in a forgotten parlor, watched the snow swirl and thicken. She had a clear view of the long drive, and she saw the first lantern flicker and die. Then the second. The wind and ice had extinguished them. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She thought of the footman, Thomas, a young man with a kind smile. She thought of the doctor, fighting his way through this. She thought of the cook, gasping for breath in the servants' quarters. She waited. Surely someone else would see. Surely the head butler, Mr. Wells, would dispatch someone. She waited for 10 minutes, then 20. The party in the great hall grew louder. Beatrice's laughter, sharp and brittle, echoed down the corridor. No one was coming. No one had noticed. Or if they had, they deemed it too dangerous to venture out. A sense of quiet, stubborn resolve settled over Linnea. She had spent her entire life waiting for others to act, to notice, to care. It was the defining feature of her existence. But this was not about her. This was about a sick woman and the man trying to reach her. She slipped out of the parlor and made her way not to the bustling main corridors, but through the quiet, cold servant passages she knew so well. In the scullery, she found what she needed: a long taper, a box of friction matches tucked into an oilskin pouch, and a heavy dark wool cloak that belonged to one of the gardeners. It smelled of earth and rain. Pulling the heavy hood over her head, she let herself out a small side door used for taking out the ash. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and driving ice crystals into her cheeks. The cold was shocking, a living thing that sought to find its way through the thick wool and into her bones. The half-mile to the gate was a battle. Snow quickly soaked the hem of her dress, chilling her to the bone. The wind tore at her cloak, trying to rip it from her grasp. At times, the snow was so thick she could barely see the ancient, gnarled trees that lined the drive. She kept her head down, one foot in front of the other, a small, determined figure in a world of white chaos. She didn't know she was being watched. In the highest room of the North Tower, Lord Valerius stood before a vast, unadorned window of leaded glass. No fire burned in the hearth. The room was utterly dark, a cavern of cold stone and shadow. He had been watching the storm's approach for hours, feeling its raw, untamed power as a kindred spirit. He was a creature of winter, of darkness, of the long, silent nights. His eyes, which in the candlelight of the great hall appeared merely dark, were here in his sanctum their true color, a deep, luminous crimson, the shade of old wine held to a dying flame. He saw everything. He saw the footman, Thomas, struggling on the road 3 miles away, his horse near exhaustion. He saw the doctor, his carriage having lost a wheel, debating turning back, and he saw the lights at his own gate go out. It was a trivial matter. His senses could guide any visitor to his door. But the lights were a symbol of welcome, of order against the chaos. Their failure was an irritant, a small sign of the sloppiness of the mortals who currently infested his home. He was about to turn away from the window, dismiss it from his mind, when he saw it. A small figure emerging from a side door, a flicker of movement in the white maelstrom. He watched, his inhuman stillness absolute, as the figure began the trek down the drive. He could feel the force of the wind, see the way it tore at the ridiculously inadequate cloak. He could sense the biting cold, the sheer, miserable effort of the journey. Any of his servants would have refused. Any of the guests would have shrieked at the mere suggestion. Yet this person, this tiny flicker of life, pushed on. He focused his ancient senses, peeling back the layers of wind and snow, and recognized the face beneath the hood. It was the quiet one, the little brown bird, the cousin. He had noticed her only in passing, a silent presence in the background of her family's noise. She was the one who never vied for his attention, who never spoke unless spoken to, whose eyes were always on a book or fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of the room. She was, he had thought, utterly unremarkable. He was wrong. He watched as she finally reached the towering wrought iron gates. Her hands, clumsy with cold, fumbled with the lantern casing. The wind fought her, trying to rip the metal door from her fingers. She shielded her body against it, a small, fragile barrier. He saw her pull out the oilskin pouch, her movements slow, deliberate. She struck a match. It flared and was instantly extinguished. She tried again and again. On the fourth try, she cupped her hands so tightly around the flame, bringing the taper to it with painstaking care. It caught. A tiny, precious spark of light. With the same infinite patience, she transferred the flame to the lantern's wick. The light bloomed, a warm golden glow that pushed back against the swirling white and gray. She didn't stop. She moved to the second lantern and repeated the entire arduous process. As the second light flared to life, casting its steady beam into the blizzard, she stood for a moment between them. A small, solitary figure who had brought light back to the darkness, not with a grand gesture, but with quiet, stubborn persistence. She had done it for no reward, for no audience. She had done it because it needed to be done. In his cold, silent tower, Lord Valerius felt a stir of something he had not experienced in mortal lifetimes. It was not warmth, not yet. It was resonance. Like a bell struck after centuries of silence. He moved from the window, a blur of motion too swift for any human eye to follow. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen and stretch, flowing after him as he descended the spiral staircase. He passed through the sleeping halls of his manor, a ghost in his own home, his feet making no sound on the ancient stone floors. Linnea, her task complete, felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The cold, which she had held at bay through sheer force of will, now seemed to seep into her very marrow. Her teeth began to chatter violently. She turned to begin the long, miserable walk back, her head bowed against the wind. She took 2 steps and then stopped. Someone was standing in front of her. He had not been there a second ago. There had been no sound of approach, no crunch of boots on the snow. He was simply there. A tall, dark silhouette against the furious white of the storm. She looked up, her hood falling back. It was him, Lord Valerius. He wore no coat, no hat, no cloak. He was dressed in the same fine black wool and white linen he had worn at dinner. The wind and snow swirled violently around them, but it seemed not to touch him. Not a single snowflake rested on his dark hair or the shoulders of his coat. The air around him was unnaturally still, and the cold emanating from him was a deep, profound cold, far older and more absolute than the winter storm. His eyes held hers. They were not black. In the warm glow of the lanterns she had just lit, she could see them clearly for the first time. They were the color of garnets, deep and glowing with a light of their own. She was too cold, too tired to be properly afraid. She simply stared, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, yet it cut through the howl of the wind as if they were standing in a silent room. It was like smoke and old wine, a low baritone that vibrated in the air between them. He said only 2 words. "Come in." He did not offer her his arm. He simply turned and began to walk back toward the house. The wind did not seem to impede him in the slightest. Linnea hesitated for only a second. Then, pulling her sodden cloak tighter, she followed in his wake. Strangely, the path behind him seemed calmer, the wind less brutal, as if his very passage tamed the storm. They did not go to the side door she had used. He led her to the grand main entrance, the towering oak doors opening for him with no visible touch. He led her into the magnificent marble-floored foyer, which was blessedly warm and silent. She stood dripping on the priceless rug, a mess of wet wool and snow, acutely aware of her state. He stood before her, perfectly dry, perfectly composed. Just then her aunt Beatrice and a few of their party came sweeping out of the great hall, alerted by the opening of the main doors. Beatrice stopped dead, her mouth falling open in disbelief. "Linnea! What in heaven's name?" Her aunt's voice was a horrified shriek. "You are dripping all over Lord Valerius's floors. Where have you been?" Beatrice's eyes narrowed, taking in the scene. The disheveled, half-frozen Linnea and the impossibly calm lord of the manor. A sneer formed on her lips. Making a spectacle of herself, no doubt. She has no sense. Lord Valerius turned his head slowly, his crimson gaze falling upon Beatrice. The warmth of the foyer seemed to vanish. The candles in their sconces flickered wildly, and the shadows in the corners of the room deepened. "She has more sense," he said, his voice soft, but carrying the chilling authority of a death sentence, "than anyone else in this house." He turned his back on them, a dismissal so complete it was like a slap in the face. His attention returned to Linnea. He saw the violent shiver that racked her small frame, the blue tinge to her lips. "You are cold," he stated, as if observing a scientific fact. He reached out, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he meant to touch her. Instead, his long, elegant fingers went to the heavy velvet portière hanging beside the doorway. With a single effortless tug, he ripped the massive curtain from its iron rod. The sound of tearing wood and metal was shockingly loud in the silence. He draped the heavy, dry velvet, thick as a winter blanket and smelling of dust and ages, around her shoulders. It was immensely heavy, but instantly its warmth began to seep through her wet clothes. He looked past her, his eyes finding the hovering, terrified form of the head butler. "Mr. Wells, Miss Ashworth's things are to be moved to the Rose Suite, in my wing." A collective gasp came from her family. The private wing of the master was sacrosanct. No guest, no matter how important, was ever housed there. "And," Lord Valerius continued, his gaze still fixed on the butler, but his words clearly meant for her family, "she is not to be disturbed. She will be assisting me with a private project." Without another word, he gestured for her to precede him up the grand staircase. Wrapped in the heavy curtain, Linnea walked past her stunned, furious relatives, her head held high for the first time in her life. She did not look back. She followed the dark, silent figure of Lord Valerius into the heart of his domain, leaving the world that had forgotten her behind. The Rose Suite was not one room, but three. A sitting room with a fireplace where a fire was already blazing, a bedroom dominated by a vast canopied bed, and a dressing room with a marble bath. Hot water was already steaming from the taps. A maid she had never seen before, with pale, watchful eyes, was there to help her. Linnea bathed and dressed in a simple but exquisitely made gown of deep blue wool that had been laid out for her. It fit perfectly. When she was warm and dry, she found Lord Valerius waiting for her in the sitting room. He stood before the fire, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece. "You will be comfortable here," he said. It was not a question. "My lord," she began, her voice a little shaky, "I don't understand." "Why?" "You performed a service," he interrupted, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion. "One that was necessary, and one that no one else had the wit or the will to perform. I reward diligence." He paused, his gaze intense. "Tomorrow morning, after you have rested, you will join me in the library. I will explain the nature of your work." And with that, he was gone, leaving as silently as he had arrived. Linnea stood alone in the magnificent room, the warmth of the fire on her skin, her mind reeling. She had left her small, cold room to light 2 lanterns, and in doing so had somehow changed the entire landscape of her life. The next morning, she made her way to the library. It was a place she had loved from her first day at the manor, but entering it now felt different. It felt like an appointment. The library was a cathedral of books, 2 stories high, with shelves stretching up into the shadowed heights, accessible by rolling ladders. A vast fireplace dominated one wall, and the air smelled of old paper, leather, and beeswax. Lord Valerius was there, not by the fire but in the center of the room, standing before a massive oak table. The surface was bare except for a single ancient-looking book, bound in dark, cracked leather, with no title. "Good morning, Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, my lord. Thank you." It was true. She had slept more soundly than she had in years, cocooned in the impossible luxury of the Rose Suite. "You wonder why I have brought you here," he stated, his crimson eyes fixed on her. "You believe it is a reward for your actions last night. It is not. It was a test. One you passed." Linnea frowned. "A test? This house," he began, gesturing to the towering shelves around them, "is not merely a collection of stone and wood. It is a repository, a library of not just books, but of memories, of histories, of lives that would otherwise be utterly lost to time." He walked slowly along a row of shelves, his fingers trailing over the spines of the books. A faint chill followed in his wake. "I have been the keeper of this place for longer than your nation has existed. I have gathered these stories, protected them." He stopped and turned to face her. The look in his eyes was ancient, filled with a weariness so profound it made her ache to see it. "But I am growing cold. My connection to the warmth, the life within these pages, is fading. The words become mere ink, the stories mere sequences of events. The heart of them is lost to me." He looked at her, and his gaze was so intense, so probing, it felt as if he were seeing not just her face, but the entire history of her lonely, quiet life. "I have been searching for someone," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Not a scholar, not a historian. I have plenty of those. I need a keeper of the flame, someone with a living, beating heart, who can feel the pulse of these stories, someone who can read them aloud and breathe life back into them, someone whose voice can make the memories live again, not just in this room but inside me." He fell silent, letting the weight of his words settle in the vast, still library. Linnea felt a tremor go through her. All her life she had been told she was quiet, plain, unremarkable. Her voice was soft, her opinions unsolicited. She was a background character. And now this powerful, terrifying man was telling her that her voice, her quiet, feeling heart, was the one thing he needed. "Last night," he continued, moving back toward the table, "in the storm, you were a small, warm light in a world of cold. You acted from a place of quiet empathy. You felt the need, and you met it, without thought of reward or recognition. That is the quality I have been searching for." He gestured to the ancient book on the table. "This is the journal of a woman who lived 500 years ago. Her name is forgotten by history. Her life was small, and to the world, insignificant. But her heart was vast. I want you to read it to me." Linnea stared at him, at the book, at the towering shelves of forgotten lives. He wasn't offering her a job. He was offering her a purpose. He was seeing in her the very things her family had dismissed: her quietness, her empathy, her deep connection to the inner lives of others. He was not just valuing them, he was telling her they were essential. "Why me?" she whispered, the question she had been holding back. "Because the world has overlooked you," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing imaginable. "And those whom the world overlooks are the only ones who are truly able to see." She looked into his ancient garnet eyes and saw a loneliness that mirrored her own, but magnified over centuries into a vast glacial expanse. And in that moment, she was not afraid of him. She felt a surge of compassion so strong it took her breath away. She made a choice, not for the luxury of the suite, not for the protection from her family, but for him. For the forgotten woman whose journal lay on the table, for all the silent voices on the shelves waiting to be heard. "I will," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will read for you." A flicker of something, surprise, relief, passed through his eyes, so quickly she almost missed it. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Then let us begin." Would you have stayed when he revealed his true, strange purpose? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. And so their strange ritual began. Every night, after the great house had settled into a restless sleep, Linnea would make her way to the library. The fire would be lit, and a single branch of candles on the great table would illuminate the page before her. Lord Valerius would be there, seated not at the table with her, but in a large, winged armchair deep in the shadows near the hearth. Sometimes she could barely see his silhouette, but she always felt his attention, a focused, unwavering intensity that was more present than any person sitting beside her had ever been. She read. She read the journal of the forgotten woman, whose name was Inez. She read of Inez's quiet life, her secret love for a stonemason, her small joys, her profound sorrows. Linnea's voice, at first hesitant, grew stronger as she lost herself in the story. She did not just pronounce the words, she felt them. She tasted Inez's grief, felt the warmth of her fleeting happiness. When she finished the journal, weeks later, there was a long silence in the library. She looked up from the last page, her eyes misty. From the shadows, his voice came, softer than she had ever heard it. "Thank you." I had not heard her voice in a century. He began to bring her other books. They were not famous histories or celebrated poems. They were personal accounts, diaries, collections of letters, ship's logs from doomed voyages, the intimate chronicles of ordinary lives, each one a universe of feeling. She read about a young soldier dying in a forgotten war, his last letter home filled with a desperate love for a world he was leaving. She read the diary of a lighthouse keeper who slowly went mad from solitude, his only companions the gulls and the relentless sea. She read the hopeful, determined letters of an immigrant girl starting a new life in a land that did not want her. With each story, the space between Linnea and the shadowed figure in the chair seemed to shrink. The chill that always accompanied him began to feel less pronounced in the library. The shadows around his chair seemed less menacing, more like a comforting darkness. They began to talk. After she would finish a passage, he would ask her questions, not about the text, but about her. "Did you feel his fear?" he asked one night, after she read of a man lost in the catacombs beneath a city. "Yes," she whispered. "But more than that, I felt his hope. He kept thinking of the sun." Another night, she read a poem full of bitter regret. "What do you think of regret, Miss Ashworth?" he asked from the darkness. Linnea thought for a moment. "I think it is a cold companion. It reminds you of all the doors you closed." He was silent for a long time after that. He learned about her. He learned of her lonely childhood, her love of wild things, her secret desire to travel, not to see grand cities, but to see the sea. He listened with an attentiveness that was like a physical touch. He never interrupted. He never judged. He simply took the small, plain truths of her life and held them as if they were precious. In turn, she began to see glimpses of him. One evening, she chose a book herself, a collection of Norse sagas. As she read of longships and frozen fjords, a low sound came from his chair, a hum. It was a haunting, ancient melody, and she realized he was humming along to the rhythm of the old Norse words she was reading. He knew the song. He had been there. The realization sent a shiver through her, but it was not of fear. It was of awe. Slowly, the dynamic between them shifted. The formality began to fray at the edges, replaced by a strange, deep intimacy. One night, a draft from the high windows made her shiver. Before she could even think to pull her shawl tighter, he was there, moving from his chair with that impossible, silent speed. He took a heavy plaid blanket from a nearby sofa and draped it carefully over her shoulders, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck. His touch was cool, like river stones, but it sent a jolt of heat through her entire body. He returned to his chair without a word, but the space between them was now charged with a new energy. Another time he passed her a new book, a slim volume of poetry. As she reached for it, her fingers brushed against his. The contact was brief, fleeting, but it was enough. The cold of his skin was a shock, but underneath it, she felt something else. A strange, thrumming stillness, like the feeling of the air just before a lightning strike. He pulled his hand back as if burned, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something uncertain in his ancient eyes. The true turning point came on a night when she was reading a particularly tragic story, a mother's account of losing her child. Linnea's voice grew thick with emotion, the words catching in her throat. She tried to push through, to maintain her composure, but the grief on the page was too raw, too real. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a hot path down her cheek. She stopped reading, mortified, and reached up to wipe it away. But his hand was there first. He had crossed the vast space between them in the space of a heartbeat. He knelt before her chair, his tall frame folding down to be level with hers. He looked at her, his crimson eyes holding not coldness, but a startling, raw emotion she couldn't name. It looked like pain. With infinite gentleness, he raised his hand, and his thumb, impossibly cool and smooth, brushed the tear from her cheek. The touch was electric. It was the most intimate gesture she had ever known. "Do not be ashamed of this," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel from his fingertips directly into her soul. "This feeling, this warmth, it is what I have been missing for an eternity." He held her gaze for a long moment, his thumb still resting against her skin. The world seemed to shrink to the space between their faces, to the warmth of her tear and the cold of his touch. She could feel the profound loneliness that radiated from him, the vast, empty centuries, and she was not afraid. She wanted to reach out, to soothe that ancient ache. He seemed to read her thoughts. A shadow of conflict passed over his face, and he slowly pulled his hand away, rising to his full height. He retreated to his chair, but the library was no longer the same. The distance between them had been irrevocably breached. This new intimacy did not go unnoticed. Though Linnea was cloistered in the library with Lord Valerius most nights, she still had to exist in the house during the day. Her family, once they recovered from the shock of her new position, treated her with a fawning, resentful respect. But her cousin Beatrice's jealousy was a poison that grew more toxic by the day. Beatrice had been utterly humiliated. The plain, invisible cousin she had tormented for years was now the favored companion of the very man she had intended to captivate. She saw the change in Linnea, a new confidence in her posture, a new light in her eyes, and she hated her for it. She found a willing accomplice in her bitterness. Lord Finch, a brutish, arrogant nobleman whose advances Beatrice had been entertaining. Finch was a bully who saw Valerius's favor toward a nobody like Linnea as a personal insult to his own status. Together, they concocted a cruel plan. The annual winter solstice ball was the pinnacle of the social season at Blackwood Manor. The entire house was thrown open, ablaze with thousands of candles. An orchestra played in the grand ballroom, and guests from all over the country came to marvel at Lord Valerius's wealth and power. Linnea, dressed in a gown of deep crimson silk that Valerius had provided, felt like a character in a dream. She was no longer invisible. People who had once looked through her now sought her out, their curiosity piqued by her mysterious closeness to their host. Valerius himself was a magnetic presence, moving through the crowd with his usual predatory grace. But his eyes, she noticed, frequently sought hers across the room, a silent, possessive connection that made her heart flutter. He even claimed her for the first dance, a formal waltz. As he held her, his hand firm and cool at her waist, she felt as if they were the only two people in the room. The world of her past, the slights, the loneliness, the invisibility, melted away. This, of course, was the final straw for Beatrice. Later in the evening, as Linnea stepped into the frosted night garden for a breath of fresh air, Beatrice's plan was put into motion. Lord Finch followed her out, his intentions clear in his leering smile. "Well, well," he slurred, his breath smelling of brandy. "The little mouse all dressed up like a lady. Think you've landed the big fish, do you?" Linnea tried to step around him, back toward the lighted doorway of the ballroom. "Excuse me, Lord Finch." He blocked her path, his bulk menacing in the moonlight. "Not so fast. I think a woman who spends her nights locked away with Valerius owes the rest of us a little entertainment. A man could get the wrong idea. Or perhaps," he added, his voice dropping to a crude whisper, "the right one." He lunged, grabbing her arm in a painful grip. Linnea cried out, struggling against him, but he was far too strong. He was dragging her deeper into the garden, toward the shadows by a frozen fountain. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. "No one will hear you," he sneered. "And by the time I'm done, the great Lord Valerius won't want you anymore." And then the garden fell silent. The sound of the orchestra from the ballroom, the rustle of the frozen leaves, even the sound of Finch's own breathing. It all stopped. The air grew instantly, unnaturally cold. A frost, thick and white, bloomed across the stone edge of the fountain. A voice spoke from the shadows behind Finch, a voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "You are mistaken." Lord Finch froze, his hand still clamped on Linnea's arm. He turned slowly. Valerius emerged from the darkness. He did not walk. He seemed to flow from it, a solid piece of the night itself. The candlelight from the ballroom did not seem to touch him. His face was a pale, beautiful mask of absolute fury, and his eyes glowed with a terrifying crimson light. The shadows around his feet were not still. They writhed and coiled like living serpents. "Let her go," Valerius said. The command was spoken quietly, but it held the weight of an avalanche. Finch, though clearly terrified, was too arrogant to back down immediately. "This is a matter between myself and the lady, Valerius. It does not concern you." Valerius smiled, a chilling, razor-thin line. "Everything she is, and everything Shvadi will ever be, concerns me." He moved. It was not a step. It was a shift in reality. One moment he was 10 feet away. The next he was directly in front of Finch, his hand closing around the man's wrist. A sharp, clean crack echoed in the frozen air. The sound of a large bone snapping. Finch screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and stumbled back, clutching his now useless arm. But Linnea did not cower. She did not shrink behind her rescuer. The fear she had felt moments ago was burned away by a white-hot rage. This man had tried to use her, to break her, to ruin the one precious thing she had found in her life. He had tried to put her back in her place as a worthless, forgotten thing. She stepped forward, planting herself firmly beside Valerius, not behind him. She looked directly into Finch's pain-filled, astonished eyes. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and cold as the winter night. "You are a coward, Lord Finch. You prey on those you think are weak, because you are terrified of anyone stronger than yourself. You are not fit to stand in this garden, let alone in this house." Valerius looked down at her, a flicker of stunned admiration in his glowing eyes. He had been ready to unmake the man before them, to unleash a horror that would have haunted the garden for 1,000 years. But her strength, her refusal to be a mere victim, held him back. She was not a fragile thing to be protected. She was a fire to stand beside. The commotion had drawn people to the doors of the ballroom. A crowd of stunned, silent faces watched from the light as Valerius stood over the whimpering Lord Finch, with Linnea, unbowed, at his side. Valerius's gaze swept over the crowd, his expression one of icy contempt. He then looked down at Finch, who was cradling his broken arm. "Get up," he commanded. Finch scrambled to his feet, tears of pain and humiliation streaming down his face. Valerius took Linnea's hand, his cool fingers lacing through hers. He led her back toward the ballroom, pulling the disgraced Finch along in his wake as if he were a dog on a leash. He did not stop in the doorway. He walked directly into the center of the ballroom, and the music shuddered to a halt. A dead silence fell over the hundreds of guests. Every eye was on the trio in the center of the room. The terrifying Lord Valerius, his face like a thundercloud, the broken Lord Finch, and the small, quiet woman who stood beside the master of the house, her hand held firmly in his. "This thing," Valerius began, his voice ringing with power in the cavernous room, "sought to harm a guest under my protection. He did so with the encouragement of another." His gaze swept the room and landed like a physical blow on Beatrice. She went white as a sheet. "Lord Finch and the entire Ashworth family," Valerius declared, his voice like the crack of a glacier, "are no longer welcome in my home or on my lands. They will be gone by sunrise. If they are not, I will not be responsible for their safety." It was a sentence of social death. To be banished from Blackwood Manor by Lord Valerius himself was a stain that would never wash away. Aunt Elspeth let out a faint sob. Beatrice looked as if she had been turned to stone. Valerius released Finch, who scurried away through the horrified crowd like the vermin he was. Then, he turned to face the assembly, his hand still holding Linnea's. He drew her slightly forward, into the light. He looked at the faces staring back at them, the same people who, for weeks, had seen her as a curiosity, a servant, a nobody. The same society that had defined her entire life by her lack of status. "You have all been mistaken," he said, his voice resonating with ancient power. "This is Linnea Ashworth. You have seen her as my assistant. You are wrong. She is the keeper of the flame of this house. She is its heart." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he lifted her hand, the one he was holding, to his lips. He did not kiss it. He simply held it there, against his mouth, a gesture of profound, public reverence. "And she is its future lady." The declaration hung in the air, more shocking than any display of violence. He was not just defending her, he was elevating her, claiming her, remaking her world in front of the very people who had made her feel worthless. Her wound, the long, deep cut of being invisible, was not just healed, it was reversed. Its scar turned into a mark of honor. Linnea looked from his intense, glowing eyes to the sea of stunned faces. She saw her aunt's utter devastation and Beatrice's apoplectic fury, and she felt nothing. They had no more power over her. She was no longer the forgotten cousin. She was seen. She was chosen. She was home. And she was loved by the ancient, powerful, and terrible vampire king. 1 year later, winter had returned to Blackwood Manor. The snow fell softly outside the library window, blanketing the world in a peaceful silence. But inside the room was warm, alive with light. A fire crackled in the hearth, and dozens of candles cast a golden glow over the towering shelves. Linnea was not just reading anymore. She and Valerius worked together now, side by side at the great table, curating the vast collection. She was learning the stories, not just from the page, but from him. He would tell her of the people he had known, the centuries he had walked, filling in the gaps the texts left behind. He was different now. The profound coldness had receded, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth that was reserved only for her. The shadows still loved him, but they no longer clung to him with the same desperate hunger. His crimson eyes, when they looked at her, were soft, filled with an affection so deep it was bottomless. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. His skin was still cool to the touch, a reminder of what he was. But it was a familiar coolness now, comforting. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. "You are quiet tonight," he observed, his voice the low, intimate rumble she had come to love. "I was just thinking," she said softly, "about the snow, about how a year ago it felt like an enemy. And now, it just feels beautiful." He brought her hand to his lips, his touch gentle against her knuckles. "It is because you are no longer fighting against the cold alone." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the snow fall. The question of her mortality had been a silent presence between them for months. She was a flickering candle flame next to his eternal, glacial stillness. He was the one to finally give it voice. "Linnea," he said, his tone serious, "there is a path we can walk together, one that does not end. It is a choice, and it must be yours, and yours alone. I will not lose you to time, but I will not take your daylight from you either." He was speaking of the endless night, of immortality, of becoming what he was. He was offering her eternity, but he was also acknowledging the price, the sun, the warmth of a mortal life. the simple, beautiful brevity of it all. He would not force her. He, who had the power to command kings and topple nations, was giving her, the girl who once had nothing, the ultimate choice. She looked at him, at this ancient, powerful being who had seen empires rise and fall, who had been alone for so long, and who had found the heart of his world in a quiet, forgotten girl in a library. She did not need to think about it. Her life had not truly begun until he saw her. "When I was a girl," she said, her voice soft but sure, "I used to read fairy tales. The princess was always saved by the handsome prince. But my story is different." She smiled, a small, genuine smile. The forgotten girl saved the lonely king. He looked at her, and the love in his eyes was a fire that warmed her to her very soul. She leaned across the table. "I choose you," she whispered. "Whatever path you walk, I will walk it with you. I choose our forever." Valerius rose from his chair and came around the table. He gently took the book from her hands, setting it aside. He drew her to her feet and simply held her, his arms wrapped around her as if she were the most precious thing in existence. His cold, ancient heart, which had been frozen for centuries, had found its keeper. It had found its flame. It had found its warmth. And in the quiet tafiet of the snow-filled night, in the heart of the ancient library, forever began. For more stories where quiet compassion conquers ancient loneliness, and where being overlooked becomes the source of true sight, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.